Welcome to tonight's story. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in, relax, and make yourself comfortable. If you enjoy these bedtime histories, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. It helps us bring more calm journeys like this one. Now, close your eyes if you wish, let the day fade away, and allow this quiet story to carry you back to ancient Rome, where the life of a gladiator was far less glamorous than legends suggest. The world of ancient Rome is often remembered for its grandeur: marble temples, triumphal arches, aqueducts carrying water across vast distances, and bustling streets filled with merchants, officials, and common citizens. Yet among all of Rome's achievements, one institution stands out as both iconic and troubling: the gladiatorial games. The Colosseum, or Flavian Amphitheater, remains one of the most famous landmarks of antiquity, a massive structure built to host spectacles that combined entertainment, politics, and brutality. When people today think of gladiators, they might picture heroic fighters, strong and fearless, admired by cheering crowds. Popular culture often presents them as tragic heroes, symbols of courage, and sometimes even as romanticized rebels. But the truth of their existence was far more complex and far more grim. Gladiators were, in most cases, not volunteers who chose a life of combat. They were usually men taken from the lowest parts of society: slaves, prisoners of war, condemned criminals, or those crushed by debt. Some joined willingly, it is true, lured by the promise of fame, or out of desperation when no other path remained. Yet for the majority, their status was not heroic at all, but deeply tragic. They were treated as property, trained and kept under strict control, and forced to fight for the entertainment of others. What seemed to the public as a glorious spectacle was, for those within it, a life marked by fear, pain, and constant uncertainty. The setting of their world was not limited to the arena. The Colosseum itself was a vast theater of violence, capable of holding tens of thousands of spectators. The noise, the chants, the roars of approval or cries for death surrounded each gladiator who stepped into the sand. But before that moment, they lived much of their existence inside gladiator schools, known as ludi. These schools were not places of learning or personal growth, but institutions closer to prisons. Surrounded by high walls under the watch of trainers and guards, gladiators ate, slept, trained, and awaited the call to perform. Their days were structured, their freedoms limited, and their futures uncertain. What made the games so compelling to Roman society was not only the combat itself, but what the combat represented. To many Romans, gladiators symbolized courage, endurance, and the power of Rome to dominate life and death. Politicians used the games to win popularity, to distract the public from hardship, or to display their generosity. The audience cheered, not always because they admired the fighters, but because they enjoyed the spectacle of control, the drama of fate decided before their eyes. For the gladiators, however, this meant that their bodies, their pain, and their very survival became tools of entertainment. The contrast between the crowd's enjoyment and the gladiators' suffering was one of the defining features of the institution. When one thinks of the daily reality for a gladiator, it becomes clear that the glamour was an illusion. Yes, they could become well known. Yes, some achieved a level of admiration or recognition. But beneath the surface, they lived in constant danger. Training injuries, harsh punishments, exhausting drills, and the looming risk of death in the arena meant that even on days when they were not fighting, they were never truly safe. Their names might be remembered for a short time, inscribed on graffiti or spoken by fans, but most were forgotten quickly, replaced by the next fighter to capture the crowd's attention. It is also important to occasionally used them as metaphors for bravery. On the other hand, they were despised for being tainted, associated with dishonor, bloodshed, and the lowest ranks of society. This contradiction, both admired and scorned, defined their existence. The image of the gladiator in popular imagination has shifted over centuries. To some, they remain heroic figures, standing proudly in the arena. To others, they represent the cruelty of Rome, a society that demanded human lives as entertainment. But when we slow down, when we look beyond the surface, we find individuals whose lives were consumed by an institution that gave them little choice. Behind the sand of the Colosseum, behind the stone walls of the training schools, and behind the cheers of the crowd, there was a constant reality of fear, discipline, and loss. This introduction to the world of Roman gladiators sets the stage for what follows. A closer look at their origins, their training, their struggles, and the many reasons why life as a gladiator was far from glorious. What may have seemed to the audience like a display of bravery was, for the men in the arena, a life of hardship, defined by chains, suffering, and the ever-present shadow of death. The story of gladiators does not begin with the Colosseum or with grand spectacles, but in the shadows of Rome's earliest traditions. Before the games became organized public entertainment, they were rooted in ritual, in ceremonies that connected life and death. Historians believe the first gladiatorial combats appeared during funeral rites. When wealthy or noble Romans died, their families sometimes staged fights in their honor, as a way of symbolizing strength, sacrifice, and the transition from life into death. These bloody displays were believed to honor the spirits of the departed, offering combat as a grim gift to the gods of the underworld. What began as sacred ritual, however, quickly evolved into something larger, transformed by Rome's hunger for power and spectacle. The origins of gladiators, then, are tied to violence, ritual, and the use of human lives as symbols. In these early contests, the fighters were often slaves or prisoners, individuals without freedom, compelled to shed blood for reasons beyond their control. Over time, as the Republic expanded, Rome absorbed countless people from conquered lands. Prisoners of war were abundant, and the Romans saw them as both spoils and resources. Instead of immediate execution, many were forced into slavery. Among the roles assigned to them was that of gladiator. The arena became a place where foreign captives could be displayed. Their suffering turned into a performance for Roman citizens. To fight as a gladiator was often the final stage in a chain of loss. The loss of homeland, the loss of family, the loss of freedom, and finally, the loss of dignity. Not all gladiators came from distant wars, however. Rome had a system of punishment for criminals, and some who were condemned found themselves in the arena. For them, fighting was not a choice but a sentence. To be marked as a gladiator meant to be branded with dishonor. A free man who fell into debt or crime might be forced into this role, forever stained by association with bloodsport. Even if he somehow survived and earned his release, society often refused to forget his time in the arena. Gladiators were considered infames, people without legal or social standing, placed on the same level as actors, prostitutes, and executioners. The label carried with it shame that followed long after the fights ended. There were also men who, though not condemned, entered gladiator life willingly. These volunteers, called octorati, were rare compared to slaves or captives, but their presence complicates the story. Why would a free man agree to surrender himself to the hardships of gladiator life? Often the answer crushing debts, poverty, or the absence of opportunity could drive a man to sell his body and his freedom to the lanista, the owner of a gladiator school. In exchange for signing his life away, he might receive an advance of money, enough to support his family or pay creditors. But once the contract was signed, his fate was sealed. He would live under the same conditions as the enslaved, bound by oath, discipline, and the will of the arena. For him, the possibility of recognition or reward was the thin hope that balanced the risk of death. The mixture of origins created a diverse population within the gladiator schools. Slaves from conquered lands spoke different languages, carried different traditions, and brought with them the bitterness of defeat. Criminals faced punishment not through quiet exile but through public combat, their bodies offered up as examples of Roman justice. Volunteers entered with heavy contracts, their willingness sometimes met with suspicion or mockery, as society questioned why any man would choose such a fate. Together, they formed a strange community, united not by friendship but by the shared weight of their circumstances. Each man's path to the arena was different, but once inside the gates, their lives followed a single course: discipline, training, and the expectation of blood. The Romans themselves were aware of these varied origins, and their attitudes reflected it. The crowd might cheer for a gladiator who fought bravely, even admire his skill, yet they rarely forgot where he came from. The label of infames was a constant reminder that, in Roman eyes, these fighters were not equals. They were instruments, tools to serve the appetites of the public and the ambitions of politicians. In this way, the origins of gladiators reveal something deeper about Roman society. They show how violence, control, and hierarchy were woven into daily life. Rome's power was built not only on the strength of its armies and the wisdom of its engineers, but also on its ability to transform suffering into spectacle. As the centuries passed, the system became more structured. Gladiatorial schools grew, training methods evolved, and the games became central to Roman entertainment. Yet the essence of their origins never changed. Gladiators began as the defeated, the enslaved, the condemned, or the desperate. They were men stripped of choice, repurposed for the needs of others. For the elite, they were instruments of political display. For the people, they were fleeting symbols of courage or suffering. For themselves, they were simply individuals caught in a system that demanded their bodies, their strength, and often their lives. When we consider the origins of gladiators, it becomes clear why their existence was so tragic. The path to the arena was rarely voluntary, and even when it was, the decision was made under crushing pressure. Whether slave, prisoner, criminal, or volunteer, each gladiator was bound by chains stronger than iron, chains of circumstance, of poverty, of defeat. Their lives remind us that beneath the spectacle of Rome's most famous games lay a reality built on suffering, coercion, and despair. Inside the gladiator schools of Rome, life followed a strict rhythm, one designed not for comfort, but for shaping men into weapons. These places, called ludi, were at once barracks, training camps, and prisons. High walls enclosed the fighters, shutting out the world beyond. The men who entered rarely chose to be there, but once inside, every day unfolded with predictable, disciplined weight. Morning began with chores. Buckets of water were drawn, the sandy training yard swept, and weapons inspected. These tasks were not glamorous, but they prepared the body and mind for the work ahead. The monotony of sweeping sand building a shield was part of a greater lesson: endurance, obedience, and repetition. The gladiator's body was a tool, and every small act served to sharpen it. Training consumed most of the daylight. Under the eye of the doctors, the fighters repeated footwork, strikes, and defensive maneuvers again and again. Wooden swords were used at first, heavier than the real ones, so that when steel was placed in their hands, it felt light, swift, almost effortless. Shields were lifted until arms shook. Spears thrust until calluses split. Bruises, sprains, and cuts were constant companions. Trainers demanded silence, focus, and precision. One wrong move in practice might mean death in the arena, so drills were repeated until reflex replaced thought. Meals came after long hours of exertion. The gladiators were fed well compared to many poor citizens of Rome. Barley porridge, beans, lentils, bread, and occasionally meat filled their bowls. The diet was heavy and intended to build mass and stamina rather than speed. Men ate together in quiet rows, conversations subdued. Between mouthfuls, some whispered memories of home or shared stories of other fighters who had impressed the trainers, who had been punished, who might soon face combat. These fragments of conversation offered a thin thread of humanity in an otherwise controlled existence. Punishment was never far. Disobedience or laziness was met with lashes, confinement, or deprivation of food. The lanista, master of the school, enforced rules with unrelenting severity. Every man understood that discipline was not a choice. It was survival. A careless soldier could weaken the school's reputation. A rebellious gladiator threatened the profits of the owner. Fear of correction hung over each action, teaching men to move carefully, speak cautiously, and accept the endless cycle of labor. The school itself was its own world. Courtyards rang with the clash of practice weapons. Barracks smelled of sweat, oil, and iron. Walls held racks of helmets and shields, polished for inspections. Infirmaries tended wounds with herbs, bandages, and crude surgery. Some fighters recovered, others healed poorly, their bodies carrying permanent reminders of training gone wrong. Broken bones, twisted joints, and festering cuts were common, but the schedule rarely slowed. A man was expected to return to drills as soon as he could stand. Despite the harshness, companionship grew among the fighters. Men relied on one another for small acts of kindness. A loaned cloak during cold nights, a shared piece of bread, a nod of encouragement before sparring. These bonds were fragile, but they mattered. Gladiators lived with the knowledge that they might one day fight side by side, or against each other. Yet in the barracks, they found a kind of brotherhood forged in struggle. Life inside the ludus also carried the constant reminder that every man was property. The lanista treated fighters as investments, calculating their worth in coin. A skilled gladiator might be shown to patrons or hired for special events. Value was measured not by dignity, but by spectacle. Even outside the arena, men learned to perform, standing tall when visitors came, showing scars with pride, displaying discipline as if it were a second skin. Their lives belonged to the school, and the school shaped them into commodities. Rest came when the lamps were dimmed and silence settled over the barracks. Sleep was not freedom, it was recovery. Dreams often echoed with the day's training. The weight of armor, the angle of a strike, the endless rhythm of combat drills. Some whispered prayers before closing their eyes, clutching small tokens or charms. Superstition offered a fragile sense of control in a life where little could be chosen. News from the outside world was rare. Rumors of battles, political shifts, or family matters reached the fighters slowly, like distant echoes. Letters from home were treasured, read over and over until the ink blurred. For most, the ludus became their entire world. The rhythms of training, punishment, and rest consumed thought, leaving little room for dreams of a different life. Over time, this routine reshaped the men. Identities blurred. They were no longer farmers, slaves, or soldiers. They became gladiators, defined by repetition and endurance. The schools stripped away individuality and built something new. Men who lived only for the arena. For some, this transformation brought pride and skill. For others, it was simply a narrowing of existence until the only horizon was the sand of the amphitheater. Life inside the gladiator schools was not only preparation for battle, it was a slow grinding away of self, a rhythm that dulled hope but sharpened the body. Each chore, each drill, each silent meal was another step in molding men into instruments of blood and spectacle. Within those walls, time was not measured by years but by the steady cycle of discipline, until the day came when the gates opened and the crowd roared, and everything practiced in silence was tested under the sun. Training for gladiators was not a matter of short sessions or casual preparation. It was relentless, stretching across the hours of each day and repeated endlessly, until muscle and memory were forced into obedience. The purpose of this training was simple but unforgiving: to harden men into fighters who could entertain crowds and survive the arena. The brutality of this process lay not only in the violence of the drills, but in the way repetition consumed body and spirit alike. From the earliest light of dawn, the yards of the gladiator schools filled with noise. Wooden swords struck against shields, trainers barked orders, and the thud of bodies hitting the sand echoed across the courtyard. Each man began with warm-ups that were hardly gentle, running in circles until the chest burned, lifting weighted logs to build strength, or dragging heavy sacks across the ground were considered only the beginning. These exercises were not meant to mimic combat, but to prepare the body for the weight and strain of constant fighting. Mock battles were staged under strict conditions. Pairs of fighters were matched by weapon type or skill, and they were ordered to engage again and again. A mistake was punished, sometimes with a crack of the whip from the trainer, sometimes with forced repetitions until exhaustion overtook the limbs. Wooden swords and blunt weapons were used most often, but they left their own marks. Deep bruises across the arms, welts across the shoulders, and swollen joints that reminded men of each error. To hesitate was to be struck. To falter was to be shamed before the others. Drills carried on without pause. Step forward, thrust, withdraw. Step to the side, block, counter. The rhythm was drilled into the men until it became automatic, even as sweat poured and sand clung to their skin. Trainers showed no mercy for fatigue. If a man collapsed, he was forced up again. If he complained, the lash awaited him. The body had to be conditioned not only to endure combat, but to endure endless training as well. Armor was introduced into the routine, heavy and cumbersome. Men marched in helmets that stifled breath, carried shields that dragged at tired arms, and wore greaves that bit into skin. To fight while weighted down was part of the lesson, for in the arena, every piece of equipment added strain. Hours passed under the sun as fighters clashed in mock duels, metal striking metal, until the clang of weapons became almost like a song that haunted their dreams. The brutality was not limited to the body. The mind, too, was worn down. Trainers berated men for slowness, for weakness, for hesitation. The insult served a purpose: to strip away doubt and force absolute focus. A gladiator who hesitated in the arena was already dead, so hesitation was crushed in training long before the crowd ever saw him. punishments were harsh but predictable. Miss a drill, and one repeated it 10 times more. Show laziness, and one felt the sting of the whip. Disobedience was rare, for every man quickly learned that resistance only brought more pain. Even mock fights carried real dangers. Wooden blades splintered, and shards cut the skin. Shields broke and left men exposed to heavy blows. Sprained ankles, broken noses, cracked ribs, and dislocated shoulders were common. There was little sympathy from the trainers. An injured fighter was not excused. He was pushed to recover quickly, sometimes too quickly, returning to the drills while wounds still ached. Pain was treated as normal, even expected. The only unacceptable weakness was refusal to continue. Food and rest were woven into this endless cycle of exertion. Meals gave the strength to repeat the ordeal the next day, but the body rarely felt recovered. Sleep was often restless, broken by soreness and the muffled sounds of other fighters shifting in their bunks. By morning, the cycle resumed again, and the body learned to move through pain as if it were another layer of armor. What made the training especially brutal was its lack of end. For most men, there was no clear goal, no graduation, no promise of freedom once enough drills were mastered. Training continued without pause. Whether a man was new or experienced, whether he was preparing for his first fight or had already survived several, the repetition was a prison of its own, grinding away at hope and individuality. The body adapted, but the spirit often grew quiet, numbed by routine. Occasionally, the training yards hosted demonstrations, where the most skilled fighters displayed techniques before visitors or wealthy patrons. In those moments, the brutality of the training revealed its other purpose: spectacle. The men were shaped not only to survive, but to impress. Their movements sharp and practiced, their endurance remarkable. To achieve this, years of harsh drills and punishments were considered necessary. Every scar, every swollen muscle, every weary sigh was part of the process of creating a man who could both fight and entertain. In the end, the training itself mirrored the violence of the arena. The difference was that in the schools, survival was not measured by life or death, but by endurance. Could the man stand after being knocked down? Could he grip the sword despite trembling arms? Could he rise the next day to repeat the same endless routine? For most, the answer was yes, not because they wanted to, but because there was no choice. Thus, the brutality of gladiator training was not hidden or softened. It was the daily reality, shaping men into instruments of combat through exhaustion, pain, and repetition. Each day blended into the next, until a fighter no longer asked when it would end. He only endured, moving from drill to drill, punishment to punishment, as if time itself had been reduced to a single, endless training session. The figure of the gladiator has long been wrapped in the imagery of fame, admiration, and glory. In paintings, in stories, and in the later imagination of history, gladiators appear as men of strength, cheered by crowds, admired by women, and celebrated as heroes. Yet behind this surface lay a reality far colder. The promise of fame was carefully constructed, almost like a mask, and what it concealed was the suffering and despair of men who had little control over their lives. The illusion of glory was a powerful tool, but it was just that, an illusion. When a gladiator stepped into the arena, thousands of eyes followed his every move. The sound of cheering filled the air, a roar that seemed to lift him higher. But the truth was that this attention was not admiration for him as a person. The crowd cheered for the spectacle, for the violence, for the blood that spilled upon the sand. One man lived, another died, and the audience left satisfied. The individual was almost invisible behind the performance. The gladiator was not admired as a man, but as as a body moving through combat, a piece of entertainment in human form. For some fighters, fame meant recognition outside the arena. Their names might be spoken in taverns, their faces remembered by regular spectators. Yet this fame was fragile. A single defeat, a single moment of weakness, and the crowd forgot. A man who had once been celebrated could be jeered the next day, mocked as a coward, or left to die without pity. Glory lasted only as long as victories did, and victories were not guaranteed. Even the strongest fighter could be brought down by chance, by injury, or by an opponent more skilled. There was also the illusion of freedom hidden within fame. Stories told of gladiators who earned their release, men who fought so well and for so long that they were granted the wooden sword of freedom, the rudis. These stories were true but rare. Most men never reached that point. For every fighter who achieved it, dozens more were broken, scarred, or killed before the chance ever appeared. The possibility of glory kept men moving, but it was a faint light, distant and dim, rarely reached. Gladiators sometimes received gifts from admirers, coins, food, even trinkets of affection. These tokens created the image of popularity, as though fighters were beloved. Yet such gifts were shallow. They did not erase the bruises of training, the exhaustion of endless drills, or the terror of stepping into combat knowing that each fight could be the last. To the crowd, generosity was part of the game, a way to participate in the spectacle. To the gladiator, it was a reminder that his life was measured in performances, not in his own worth. The illusion of fame also hid the truth of social status. No matter how skilled, no matter how admired within the arena, gladiators remained outcasts. They were slaves, criminals, or condemned men, viewed as dishonorable by the very society that cheered for them. Roman citizens might praise their courage in the arena, but they would not welcome them as equals outside it. A gladiator could inspire awe in combat, but in the streets he might be shunned, distrusted, or even despised. The contradiction was sharp. Adored in the moment of violence, rejected in the quiet of everyday life. The idea of glory was reinforced by those who controlled the games. Organizers spoke of honor, of bravery, of noble combat. They promoted the image of the gladiator as a figure of Roman strength and discipline. This made the games more appealing to the audience, who could believe they were witnessing something grand rather than simply cruel. But for the men who fought, this language was a cage. It disguised their suffering as honor, their captivity as service, their deaths as entertainment. Inside the gladiator schools, even this illusion was cultivated. Trainers spoke of victory, of the rewards awaiting the successful fighter. They told stories of men who gained their freedom, who were remembered for generations. These tales gave fighters something to cling to, a thin thread of hope. Yet most knew deep down that the odds were against them. The fame of a few stood atop the forgotten deaths of many. In reality, glory was more of a burden than a gift. A man known for his skill was pushed harder, matched against stronger opponents, expected to survive again and again. Fame made the crowd demand more, and each fight became more dangerous. To be known meant to face greater risks. The higher a gladiator rose, the further he had to fall. Many who once basked in the cheers of the crowd ended their lives in the sand, remembered only for a moment, then quickly replaced by the next spectacle. For the gladiator himself, the illusion of fame often brought loneliness. Surrounded by crowds, he remained isolated. Applause could not fill the emptiness of captivity, nor did it erase the knowledge that each cheer was built upon his pain. A man could stand in the center of the arena, bathed in noise, and still feel utterly alone. Fame was loud, but it did not comfort. Glory was bright, but it did not warm. Thus, the life of a gladiator was marked by this cruel paradox. Celebrated yet despised, cheered yet forgotten, admired yet enslaved. The illusion of fame was one of the greatest tricks of the arena, convincing both fighters and spectators that something noble was taking place. But beneath it all lay only survival, struggle, and the quiet truth that glory was fleeting, fragile, and often fatal. Life as a gladiator in ancient Rome was perpetually overshadowed by the possibility of death. From the moment a man was enlisted or forced into the ludus, the awareness of mortality became a quiet, constant companion. It was not a distant threat, but an immediate, tangible presence, woven into every movement, every drill, and every moment of the day. The fear of death shaped thought, action, and even the rhythms of sleep, creating a slow, pervasive tension that never fully disappeared. In the training yards, the risk of fatal injury was always near. Wooden swords splintered unexpectedly, shields gave way, and a misstep could result in a fractured bone or a concussion. Trainers did not shield the men from these dangers. Instead, they pressed them harder, pushing fighters to overcome fear by rehearsing it repeatedly. Each exercise was not only physical preparation but also a mental rehearsal for mortality. The constant awareness that one false move could end life made every drill sharper, every strike more deliberate, and every footstep cautious. Within the arena, the fear of death intensified. The crowd's roar amplified the stakes, but it did nothing to lessen the danger. Fighters faced opponents who were often equally skilled, and sometimes they were pitted against multiple adversaries simultaneously. The design of the games ensured that survival was never guaranteed. A gladiator could train meticulously for years, perfecting every maneuver, yet still face a day when fate, luck, or sheer chance would decide his life. The unpredictability of combat was a shadow hanging over all preparation. Death was not only a physical reality but a social one. Gladiators were enslaved or bound by contracts, and their survival had value primarily as a commodity. Patrons and organizers measured the skill and endurance of a fighter in terms of profitability. A man who lived long enough to perform many fights brought fame and coin, but each additional match increased the probability of fatal injury. Survival was rewarded, yet prolonged life meant more exposure to danger. This added a layer of tension, a slow accumulation of anxiety that never fully lifted, day after day. Even moments of apparent safety carried reminders of mortality. Within the ludus, men observed the consequences of failed fights. Bruises, disfigurements, and sometimes bodies that never rose again. Every scar on a comrade's face, every limping step, and every whispered story of an unexpected death reinforced the constant presence of risk. These observations shaped the psyche, teaching that death was inevitable and preparation was the only defense. Sleep offered little reprieve. In the barracks, bodies ached from the day's exertion, but the mind continued to measure danger. Dreams often carried the weight of the arena. Imagined fights, miscalculated strikes, the glint of a weapon aimed too high or too low. Even in slumber, the possibility of death lingered, a background hum that reminded the gladiator that life was fragile, fleeting, and uncertain. Rest was necessary, but it could not erase the persistent fear that awaited each new day. Daily routines were infused with small rituals of control. Gladiators might check weapons carefully, inspect armor, and rehearse strikes in quiet corners, actions meant to assert mastery over circumstances integrated into every motion, every thought, and every gesture. Even victories in the arena did not dispel this fear. Winning a fight meant surviving, but survival did not erase the risk of the next bout. Each encounter reminded the gladiator that life was temporary, and safety was always provisional. The mind learned to measure time not in months or years, but in individual fights, in small victories against injury, in narrow escapes from harm. This compression of time lent a rhythm to life that was both oppressive and practical, shaping thought around survival rather than hope or long-term plans. Social bonds offered minor solace, but they too were tinged with awareness of mortality. Fellow fighters could provide assistance, encouragement, or shared knowledge, yet each companion was equally subject to death. Friendships were lived in the shadow of impermanence, teaching men to depend on each other without ever assuming continuity. In this way, the fear of death was both personal and collective, a shared understanding that shaped interactions, trust, and the slow pacing of daily life. Ultimately, the constant fear of death became a defining characteristic of the gladiator's existence. It shaped the pace of life, the rhythm of thought, and the very way the body moved. Men were trained not only in combat skills but in endurance under perpetual threat, learning to navigate danger with cautious efficiency. The arena was not simply a place of spectacle. It was the crucible in which the fragility of life was both demonstrated and rehearsed, moment by moment, repetition by repetition. Within this slow, inevitable presence of mortality, the gladiator learned the subtle art of living with danger. Every step, every swing, and every breath carried the quiet knowledge that death might come, and the body and mind were trained to endure, to survive, and to continue day after day, drill after drill, until the uncertain end finally arrived. The life of a gladiator was a life shaped not only by combat and training but by the simple, unrelenting necessity of nourishment. Food was not a pleasure, nor was it a choice freely made. It was a tool, carefully measured and allocated to serve the purpose of endurance, strength, and survival. Each meal followed a pattern that emphasized bulk, energy, and the slow accumulation of weight and stamina, rather than variety, taste, or indulgence. Breakfast was early, taken before the day's first drills. Often it consisted of porridge made from barley or other grains, sometimes mixed with water or a thin wine-like liquid for flavor. Occasionally, a small portion of dried fruit or honey was added, but such luxuries were rare. The porridge was thick and bland, eaten quickly, often standing or in quiet rows, without conversation. The act of eating itself was secondary to the function it served. Fuel for the body, preparation for the exertion ahead. Between breakfast and the morning drills, men might take small supplements of legumes, beans, or lentils. These were easy to store, filling, and rich in protein, contributing to muscle maintenance. Bread, coarse and heavy, was a staple, eaten at nearly every meal. The texture was rough, the flavor muted, but it provided the necessary energy to withstand hours of repetitive, brutal training. Some schools added herbs for minor flavor, but the primary focus was nourishment, not enjoyment. Lunch followed hours of exercise and mock combat. The midday meal was similar to breakfast but larger, intended to replenish calories burned during the morning. Barley porridge again played a role, along with boiled pulses or occasionally small portions of meat, most commonly pork or beef, though fresh meat was not guaranteed every day. The diet emphasized slow digestion and sustained energy release. A gladiator's stomach became accustomed to routine. the act of eating almost ritualistic, a repetition that mirrored the drills themselves. Drinking water was plentiful but unflavored. Sweet beverages or wine were reserved for rare occasions, sometimes given as a reward or to wealthy patrons' favored fighters. Most of the time, men drank to quench thirst, not to taste, and the act of drinking became part of the measured, controlled rhythm of daily life. The body learned to rely on plain sustenance, to find comfort in calories rather than flavors, to measure energy in units of survival rather than pleasure. Snacks were infrequent. Occasionally, roasted chickpeas or small amounts of nuts were offered, sometimes as a reward for endurance or skill during training. Even these minor additions were functional, dense in nutrients, light in preparation, portable and consistent. The gladiator's life did not allow for indulgence. Sweetness or richness might delay hunger, but it did not improve resilience. Each bite was a small investment in the next hour of labor, each swallow a contribution to the ongoing struggle for survival. The evening meal was consumed after the day's main training sessions, often under fading light. Porridge and bread returned, sometimes accompanied by stews of vegetables or legumes. Fat was introduced sparingly, through small amounts of oil or animal fat, designed to build mass and protect the body from extreme exertion. Meals were quiet, subdued, and functional. Conversation was minimal. The emphasis was on consumption, on replenishment, and on preparing for the next day's regimen. Diet was not about choice. It was not about preference. Gladiators did not select spices or flavors or enjoy the comfort of variety. Instead, every meal was measured, calculated, and consistent. It was an unremarkable sequence of nourishment, repeated daily, designed to build a body capable of enduring pain, injury, and relentless effort. The monotony of food mirrored the monotony of drills. Each day, each bite, each swallow followed the rhythm of survival. Despite its plainness, the diet succeeded in its purpose. Men built muscle, developed endurance, and maintained energy over long periods of activity. The weight gained, the resilience developed, and the stamina built allowed them to survive in the arena longer than untrained men. Yet the limits of nourishment were clear. The food could not replace injuries, soothe exhaustion, or comfort the spirit. Its role was purely functional, a tool of survival rather than a source of pleasure. Even the act of chewing became a form of mental preparation. As the body processed grains and legumes, the mind shifted focus to the day ahead, to the drills, to the dangers that awaited. Each meal was a reminder of necessity, of repetition, of the small rituals that sustained life in an otherwise harsh and unforgiving existence. Eating became part of the rhythm of the school, a slow cadence that shaped thought and body together, building the endurance required not only for combat but for the long, monotonous days of training. Gladiators learned to endure hunger as well as fullness. Portions were consistent, sometimes sparse, and the body adapted to efficiency, storing energy and using it precisely. The diet became a companion to the constant grind, an unchanging feature of daily existence. Meals were predictable, just like the routines of exercise, punishment, and rest. The life of a gladiator was structured, repetitive, presence required of every man within the walls of the ludus, preparing him, day by day, bite by bite, for the brutal reality of the arena and the unrelenting demands of a life spent in service to survival and spectacle. The life of a gladiator was defined not only by the relentless training, the repetitive drills, and the daily endurance of hunger and fatigue, but also by the constant presence of weapons and armor. These tools of combat were simultaneously protective and dangerous, heavy and cumbersome, practical and oppressive. Each gladiator was assigned equipment according to type, status, and the style of fighting that he was trained to perform. These distinctions created a rhythm within the school and the arena, a slow, almost ritualistic division of labor and responsibility that influenced every movement, every step, and every breath. The weapons varied, each chosen to suit a specific kind of combat. The gladius, short and sharp, was designed for thrusting, stabbing, and quick movements. Its weight seemed light in the hand at first, but after hours of repetition, it became a heavy extension of the arm, a constant presence reminding the fighter of danger. The sikha, a curved sword favored by certain classes, required careful maneuvering. It was elegant in its design, yet its use demanded precision and timing, for a misstep could leave the user exposed. Spears, tridents, and nets were allocated to others, each creating a different rhythm, a different flow of movement in the arena. Each weapon required adaptation, practice, and a complete understanding of both its strengths and its deadly limitations. Armor, meanwhile, was both a burden and a shield. Helmets, sometimes weighted and constricting, obscured vision and muffled sounds, forcing gladiators to rely on heightened attention to movement and instinct. The metal pressed against the head, creating a slow ache with prolonged wear. Chest plates, greaves, and arm guards provided protection but restricted movement, adding weight and challenge to every swing of the weapon, every step across the sand. The act of putting on armor became ritualistic, a slow process that required patience, strength, and acceptance of discomfort. The protective qualities were obvious, yet the burdens were ever present, shaping posture, endurance, and the experience of every mock battle and real fight. Different gladiator types were matched with different weapons and armor to create contrasts in the arena, to provide spectators with variation, and to heighten the drama of combat. A heavily armored secutor faced a lightly equipped retiarius, wielding only a net and trident. The imbalance of protection and agility created spectacle, yet it also increased risk. The secutor could struggle to move quickly, while the retiarius relied on strategy, timing, and chance. The deliberate pairing of uneven opponents meant that fairness was rarely a concern. Fights were designed for visual drama, not for the safety of the fighters. The audience's enjoyment came at the expense of predictability and security, and every man stepped into the arena knowing that risk was not a possibility, but a certainty. Training with weapons and armor mirrored the conditions of the arena. Weighted practice swords, reinforced shields, and cumbersome helmets were used to accustom the body to strain. Repetitions of strikes, parries, and maneuvers became long, repetitive, and monotonous, with the weight of the equipment slowly wearing down endurance. Each strike required careful thought, each step demanded balance, and each moment carried the potential for injury. Even in practice, the tools of survival were also instruments of fatigue. The body learned to endure not only the blows of others but the weight of its own protection and armament. The risks were never theoretical. Blades splintered, shields cracked, and helmets failed to absorb impact completely. Minor errors could escalate into serious injury, as an exposed wrist or a misaligned stance allowed the opponent to strike with full force. Armor could deflect, yet it could also be a source of vulnerability if misused or poorly fitted. Each gladiator learned to move deliberately, limitations and dangers of his own equipment. The process was slow, meticulous, and mentally exhausting, a daily lesson in both survival and patience. Different weapons required different strategies, and these strategies were drilled endlessly. The gladius demanded close engagement, careful angles, and precise timing. The trident required space, awareness of reach, and the ability to maneuver quickly around an opponent. The net could entangle or trap, yet wielding it meant sacrificing balance, speed, or protection. Every weapon carried not only the promise of victory but also the inevitability of risk. Each strike was calculated, each block rehearsed, each maneuver rehearsed in repetition until muscle memory and instinct converged. Yet no amount of preparation could entirely eliminate danger, and each fight in the arena remained unpredictable. Armor and weapons also carried psychological weight. The knowledge that they could save life or fail in an instant created a constant tension. A helmet might protect the skull, yet blind the eye. A shield might block a blow, yet leave the shoulder exposed. A sword could pierce an opponent, yet cause injury if mishandled. The gladiator learned to move through the burden, to adapt to the discomfort, and to coexist with danger as an inseparable companion. The weight was felt not only physically but mentally, a reminder that survival was always precarious. Even routine maintenance of equipment was slow and repetitive. Blades had to be sharpened, shields inspected, and armor repaired. Every piece required attention, care, and awareness. Neglect could result in injury, humiliation, or death in the arena. The act of tending to weapons and armor became part of the daily rhythm, a quiet, monotonous preparation for the violence that awaited. Each gesture, each swipe of a blade, each tightening of a strap reinforced the slow cadence of life under constant threat. Ultimately, the weapons and armor of a gladiator were double-edged. They offered protection, shaped identity, and defined the rhythm of life, yet they carried with them the weight of inevitability and the constant reminder of risk. Every step taken, every swing of a weapon, every moment in the arena was influenced by the interplay of burden and danger. The life of a gladiator was marked by repetition, endurance, and the slow, monotonous negotiation between defense and exposure, protection and peril, survival and the ever-present possibility of death. The arena was the center of a gladiator's world, a place where all preparation, training, and endurance culminated in a slow, relentless confrontation with danger. From the first step through its massive gates, the reality of life as a gladiator became vivid, unavoidable, and overwhelming. The path leading into the sand was narrow, flanked by walls rising high above, enclosing both spectacle and danger. The air was thick with anticipation, dust, and the scent of sweat, blood, and straw, creating a slow, oppressive atmosphere that pressed upon the body and mind alike. As the gates opened, a roar washed over the gladiator. The sound was not merely loud. It was a continuous, undulating force, carrying the energy, excitement, and expectation of thousands of spectators. It filled every space, vibrating through the sand, through the legs, and into the chest. The noise was almost physical, pressing against the body, demanding attention, and signaling that each step forward was irreversible. There was no escape, no pause. The arena commanded presence, awareness, and endurance. Each cheer, each shout, each rhythmic chant reminded the gladiator that survival depended on constant vigilance, speed, and precision. The sight of the audience intensified the sensation of exposure. Thousands of eyes, unblinking and eager, followed every motion, analyzing, judging, and celebrating the spectacle. Faces blurred together into a single wave of observation, yet each gladiator moved slowly, deliberately, aware that each motion was amplified by the thousands of gazes fixed upon him. Even the sand underfoot seemed heavier, each step calculated to maintain balance and readiness, to keep the body prepared for the inevitable confrontation. The first moments in the arena were deliberate and ritualized. Fighters were arranged, introduced, and sometimes paraded, their bodies and equipment highlighted to the audience. This slow procession was designed to amplify tension, to increase anticipation, and to remind each man that his life had become a public commodity. The eyes of spectators were heavy and constant, their expectations unrelenting. Even before combat began, the psychological weight of the arena was profound. The body learned to react not only to the opponent but to the environment, to the pressure of observation, to the ever-present possibility of injury or death. Combat itself was a slow, continuous negotiation between skill, strategy, and sheer survival. Each movement was deliberate. A step forward, a pivot, a swing, a parry. Weapons met, clashed, or missed, creating rhythms of sound that echoed across the sand. Blood quickly became visible, marking the surface of the arena and confirming the physical consequences of each action. Injuries were immediate and undeniable. Cuts, bruises, broken limbs, and the occasional fatal strike. The arena transformed the abstract risks of training into tangible, immediate reality. Survival was no longer theoretical. It became a careful, conscious engagement with both the opponent and the environment. The danger was compounded by the diversity of opponents. Gladiators were often matched against fighters of different styles, strengths, or experience. Heavy, armored fighters faced nimble, lightly armed opponents. Quick, agile men faced more powerful, less mobile combatants. The combination of skills, weights, and tactics created an unpredictable and prolonged challenge, where every decision could be fatal. The crowd's cheers encouraged risk, prompting bold moves and exposing weaknesses, increasing the intensity of danger while simultaneously ensuring the spectacle remained slow, dramatic, and hypnotically detailed. Even moments of apparent control were deceptive. A strike that seemed solid could glance unexpectedly. A block could fail to absorb a blow fully, and the shifting sands underfoot altered timing and balance. The environment itself became a participant in the fight, adding slow, unpredictable variables that demanded constant attention. Each breath, each heartbeat, each movement was measured, intentional, and deliberate. The arena imposed a rhythm of vigilance that seeped into every thought, every action, every pause between attacks. The slow passage of time in the arena was amplified by repetition. Each strike, block, and maneuver felt extended, each moment drawn out by awareness, anticipation, and fear. Injuries accumulated gradually, fatigue built silently, and the mind oscillated between strategy and survival. The fight was a cycle of measured effort, repeated until exhaustion, until injury, until the eventual conclusion. Victory brought relief, but not reprieve. Defeat, injury, or death brought finality, marking the completion of one slow, exhaustive chapter and the preparation for the next. The arena was not only a place of combat, but of observation, of judgment, and of spectacle. Life and death were both literal and symbolic, representing endurance under constant scrutiny. Men learned to move through pain, through fear, and through the constant presence of thousands of eyes. Every step, every swing, and every breath became a meditation in motion, a slow, rhythmic engagement with the realities of mortality and spectacle. In this way, the reality of the arena was comprehensive. It encompassed sight, sound, touch, and emotion. It imposed a deliberate pace, emphasizing the slow accumulation of fatigue, fear, and physical strain. The crowd, the environment, the weapons, and the opponents all contributed to a continuous, measured tension, one that required endurance, patience, and an acceptance of risk. The arena was the ultimate expression of a gladiator's existence. Slow, repetitive, brutal, and unrelenting, yet carefully structured, hypnotic, and rhythmically detailed, perfect for the slow, calm cadence of reflection that defined life within and beyond its walls. In the life of a gladiator, injuries were not rare or occasional. They were a constant and inevitable part of existence. Every step taken in the ludus, every swing of a weapon, and every moment spent in the arena carried the possibility of harm. Cuts, bruises, broken bones, sprains, and punctures were part of the slow rhythm of daily life. Reminders that the body was fragile, that pain was permanent, and that survival was never guaranteed. The awareness of vulnerability shaped every action, every movement, and every breath, instilling a quiet tension that persisted even in moments of rest. Minor wounds were frequent. A small cut from a sword edge, a bruise from a heavy shield, a twisted ankle from shifting sands. These injuries were routine, almost mundane in their inevitability. Yet even the smallest wound had the potential to escalate into a more serious problem. Blood attracted attention, and the body's natural responses, like swelling and fever, were reminders that injury could progress silently. Each bruise, each nick, became part of the slow, monotonous accumulation of physical evidence of the risks inherent in a gladiator's life. More severe injuries, however, could alter the course of a man's life entirely. Broken limbs were not uncommon, and they carried the slow, drawn-out process of healing, if healing was possible. The medical knowledge available in the time of the gladiators was rudimentary at best. Treatments were often crude, limited to splints, poultices, and repeated washing with water or herbal infusions. Pain relief was minimal, and antiseptics, as we understand them today, did not exist. Infection was an ever-present threat, capable of turning a minor wound into a life-threatening condition, and the slow progression of infection could be both physically debilitating and psychologically oppressive. The gladiators' medical care was functional rather than nurturing. Healers within the ludus attended primarily to survival, focusing on injuries that could allow the fighter to continue training or enter the arena again. Cosmetic repair or long-term rehabilitation was rarely a priority. Every treatment followed a slow, methodical process, with careful attention to what could be controlled and an acceptance of what could not. Bandages were applied, herbs were laid, and the gladiator was left to endure the discomfort and uncertainty, day after day, repetition after repetition. Pain, therefore, became a companion. The body adapted to discomfort, learning to function even when partially impaired. Small injuries were managed with endurance and routine, while major injuries imposed slow, deliberate limitations on movement. Training incorporated recovery, but the pace remained relentless. There was little room for rest beyond the slow adjustment of physical activity. Each injury was integrated into the rhythm of daily life, a constant reminder of mortality and fragility. The risk of permanent damage was omnipresent. Scars, limps, and weakened joints were common outcomes, shaping the body in ways that were slow, cumulative, and often irreversible. Gladiators learned to move in ways that compensated repetition of this adaptation became part of the quiet, monotonous rhythm of survival, a daily negotiation between capability and vulnerability. The body, marked by experience and injury alike, became a living record of the slow accumulation of risk and endurance. Psychological effects were equally slow and pervasive. Knowing that any fight could result in injury created a constant background tension. Fear of damage influenced movement, timing, and decision-making. Every swing was measured, every block carefully executed, and every step calculated. The mind learned to inhabit the body with heightened awareness, integrating past injuries into anticipation of future harm. Even in moments of perceived safety, the shadow of potential injury persisted, a slow, quiet companion that shaped thought and action alike. Medical interventions themselves were slow and repetitive. Healing required patience, monitoring, and careful attention. Bandages had to be reapplied, poultices refreshed, and splints adjusted. The body's response had to be observed continuously, with vigilance for signs of infection or further injury. This slow, deliberate attention mirrored the overall rhythm of a gladiator's life. Repetitive, structured, and measured. The act of care became a ritual, blending necessity with endurance, and reinforcing the slow cadence of existence under constant risk. Infections were the slowest and most unpredictable dangers. Fever, swelling, and pus developed gradually, often unnoticed until the condition became critical. Treatments were limited to herbal applications or cauterization in extreme cases. Survival depended on endurance as much as on intervention, and the mind adapted to coexist with the uncertainty of infection. Daily routines incorporated observation, hygiene, and cautious activity to minimize risk, but even the most careful management could not eliminate danger. Ultimately, injuries and medical care defined much of the gladiator's daily rhythm. Pain, recovery, treatment, and vulnerability were constants, slow and unchanging, integrated into the monotony of training and combat. The body became both instrument and record of endurance, survival, and suffering. Healing was methodical, repetitive, and often incomplete, and the ever-present possibility of infection or permanent damage reminded every man of the fragility of existence. The gladiator learned to coexist with injury, to integrate it into daily routines, and to accept the slow accumulation of physical wear. Each scar, each ache, each small wound was part of the quiet, measured, and repetitive reality of life in the ludus and the arena. Survival required patience, endurance, and the continual negotiation with the body's limitations. Injuries were not merely setbacks. They were companions, shaping thought, movement, and the slow cadence of existence, becoming part of the hypnotic rhythm of life lived constantly on the edge between endurance and destruction. In the life of a gladiator, no aspect of existence was more public, more observed, or more psychologically demanding than the presence of the crowd. The arena was not only a place of combat, but a theater of judgment, where thousands of eyes, thousands of voices, and thousands of expectations combined into a slow, continuous pressure that shaped every motion, every decision, and every breath. The audience's role extended beyond passive observation. It was active, deliberate, and pervasive, influencing outcomes and reinforcing the slow rhythm of spectacle and control that defined the gladiator's world. The crowd's influence was visible from the moment the gates opened. Cheers, shouts, and the rhythmic pounding of thousands of feet created a sensory environment that was both oppressive and hypnotic. The sound pressed down, undulating through the sand, vibrating through the body, reminding each fighter that every step taken was under scrutiny. Attention to movement, posture, acceptance that life and death in the arena were inseparable from public observation. Spectators were not neutral. Their attention, judgment, and mood could determine the fate of a gladiator. A gesture, a missed step, or a successful strike could elicit cheers or boos, influencing the perception of skill, courage, or failure. Decisions regarding mercy or punishment were often shaped by the collective response of the crowd. The thumb, raised or lowered, became a slow, symbolic gesture capable of altering the course of life or death. Even small expressions of approval or disapproval carried profound weight, contributing to a continuous, measured tension that underscored the slow, repetitive, and hypnotic rhythm of arena life. The spectacle of the games extended beyond the fight itself. Processions, introductions, and rituals added layers of ritualized observation, each act drawn out in slow, deliberate sequences that emphasized the theatrical nature of combat. Gladiators were presented, paraded, and made visible to the masses, reinforcing the duality of their existence, both revered and expendable. The act of display became part of daily experience, shaping movement, posture, and psychological endurance. Every step was deliberate, every pause calculated, every swing of the weapon synchronized with awareness of observation and expectation. Politics and control were embedded in the structure of the games. The crowd was not merely entertained. It was managed, influenced, and manipulated. Spectacle served as a means to maintain order, display power, and distract attention from broader societal pressures. The lives of gladiators were entwined with civic ritual, performance, and authority. Their suffering, endurance, and skill were observed slowly, rhythmically, and repeatedly, creating a hypnotic cycle of spectacle that reinforced hierarchy, obedience, and social cohesion. The games were as much about governance as about sport, and the crowd's judgment became a vehicle for maintaining control, slow and methodical in its influence. The influence of the audience extended to the slow, cumulative shaping of gladiators themselves. Performances were adapted to spectacle, tactics were modified to entertain, and injuries were endured or concealed to maintain dramatic tension. Every aspect of life in the arena was informed by observation, each action calibrated to audience expectations. This constant mediation between survival and entertainment created a repetitive, monotonous pattern, integrating awareness, anticipation, and adjustment into every movement. The body learned to respond not only to combat but to performance, endurance, and the slow rhythms of judgment. Spectators also contributed to the psychological burden. The knowledge that thousands of eyes were focused intently, observing every flaw, hesitation, or success, created an unrelenting tension. Even in moments of preparation or training outside the arena, the memory of the crowd's gaze lingered. Movements were rehearsed with anticipation of judgment. The presence of observation became a continuous, slow, and monotonous influence, shaping posture, thought, and action, long before combat began and long after it ended. Death, injury, and mercy were all mediated by the collective will of the public. The gestures of spectators, the rhythm of cheers, and the slow escalation of attention combined to create outcomes that were part performance, part judgment, and part randomness. Even skill, preparation, and endurance were filtered through the slow, hypnotic lens of public evaluation. The crowd's role was comprehensive, omnipresent, and unceasing. Each step, each maneuver, each pause carried the invisible weight of thousands of silent and vocal judgments. Over time, gladiators became accustomed to the slow rhythm of public scrutiny. The crowd's presence, once overwhelming, became part of the daily cadence of life. Movements were performance was measured against applause, and every injury or exertion was contextualized within the broader spectacle. The audience shaped the flow of combat, the tempo of preparation, and the psychological landscape of the fighters, creating a slow, continuous, and repetitive cycle that defined life in the arena. Ultimately, the role of the crowd and the public spectacle was both pervasive and hypnotic. The arena existed as a stage where survival, performance, and observation intertwined in a slow, repetitive rhythm. Life and death, injury and endurance, fear and anticipation, all became elements of the spectacle, integrated into a continuous pattern of observation and judgment. The crowd's presence was a constant, shaping the body, the mind, and the slow cadence of existence. In this way, the life of a gladiator was inseparable from the gaze of the public. Slow, measured, hypnotic, and unrelenting, a perpetual cycle of observation, endurance, and performance. For a gladiator, admiration from the crowd and fleeting moments of fame did little to alter the fundamental reality of life as a slave. Every action, every decision, and every moment of time was bound by the control of others. Ownership was not a metaphor but a literal fact. The body, the labor, the very movements of daily life belonged to someone else, whether a lanista, a trainer, or the institution of the ludus. The slow, steady awareness of this constraint shaped thought, posture, and the rhythm of existence. Freedom was not absent in an abstract sense. It was inaccessible, distant, and almost irrelevant in daily routines. The structure of daily life emphasized constraint. Each day began and ended according to the orders of those in authority. Meals, training, practice fights, rest, and even time for recovery were scheduled and monitored. Choices were limited and carefully circumscribed. Decisions about movement, whether in the training grounds or the arena, were dictated not only by the physical necessity of survival, but also by obedience to the imposed order. This repetition, the slow accumulation of scheduled tasks, created a hypnotic rhythm. The body learned compliance, endurance, and adaptation to a life with few options. Beyond the immediate demands of survival, personal freedom was constrained in long-term matters as well. Gladiators had little control over marriage, relationships, or the formation of families. Those bonds, if permitted, were monitored or regulated by owners. The possibility of leaving the profession, pursuing a different life, or making autonomous decisions about one's own future was limited. Plans and aspirations had to be slow, measured, and realistic, within the narrow scope allowed by servitude. The repetition of small compromises, the careful navigation of authority, and the silent acceptance of constraint became part of the daily experience. A subtle, persistent rhythm of life that weighed as heavily on the mind as armor weighed on the body. Even success did not fundamentally change the condition of captivity. A victorious gladiator, admired and celebrated, remained under the authority of others. Honors, applause, and fleeting gifts did not erase the constraints of ownership. They were interlaced with obligation and expectation, reminders that admiration could not substitute for autonomy. The rhythm of training, the slow pacing of drills, and the methodical repetition of movements continued unbroken, regardless of fame. The mental burden of knowing that personal achievement did not equate to freedom was continuous, reinforcing the hypnotic monotony of daily existence. Slavery imposed a psychological weight as persistent and pervasive as the physical challenges of combat. The constant awareness of surveillance, obedience, and imposed limits shaped thought, movement, and the perception of opportunity. Every action, from lifting a weapon to entering the arena, carried subtle reminders of external control. Even moments of rest were tempered by the knowledge that authority could intervene, redirect, or punish at any time. Life became a slow exercise in adaptation, endurance, and the quiet negotiation of constraints. The lack of freedom extended to choices of daily routine and personal expression. Hairstyles, clothing, and even gestures were often dictated by authority or by the expectations of the arena. Expression was limited and carefully moderated. The repetition of compliance, the ongoing moderation of behavior, and the careful management of action created a rhythm that was slow, persistent, and deeply internalized. Over time, this repetition became a pattern, an almost automatic response to the constant presence of control. Ownership and control extended to the gladiator's future, with contracts, obligations, and debts dictating the course of years. Even survival could be a form of continued captivity, as life remained structured by the decisions of others. The daily rhythm of life, from dawn to dusk, became a continuous cycle of preparation, submission, and measured endurance. Each step, each swing of a weapon, each breath was shaped by the slow, methodical presence of authority. Physical conditioning, skill development, and mastery of combat techniques were also intertwined with servitude. Each exercise, drill, and fight was not solely a matter of survival, but a reflection of obedience. Training was repetitive, slow, and deliberate, reinforcing the reality of ownership. The body and mind moved in coordination with imposed schedules, rhythms, and expectations. Strength, agility, and endurance were cultivated, but always within the framework of limitation. Even admiration could become an instrument of subtle control. Recognition by the crowd, praise from superiors, or rewards were administered in ways that reinforced obedience. Moments of apparent choice or privilege were often slow, calculated manipulations of behavior, reinforcing submission to authority. The repetition of this dynamic created a mental landscape where autonomy was deferred, delayed, and rarely realized. Ultimately, the life of a gladiator under slavery was defined by constraint, repetition, and the continuous interplay of admiration and obligation. Every step, every movement, and every breath carried reminders of control. Even as muscles strengthened, endurance increased, and skills developed, the freedom to direct one's own life remained largely inaccessible. The rhythm of existence was slow, repetitive, and unchanging, marked by the persistent weight of authority and the quiet, constant awareness of the limitations imposed by servitude. In this way, the lack of freedom became a subtle, persistent companion, shaped thought, behavior, and physical endurance. It was a slow, monotonous reality, woven into the daily life of every gladiator. The paradox of admiration without autonomy, fame without choice, and survival within constraint defined existence. The body, the mind, and the rhythm of life were all orchestrated by external forces, creating a hypnotic, repetitive, and unrelentingly measured experience, perfectly aligned with the slow, calm cadence of narration designed to lull into sleep. While the majority of gladiators were men, there were women who stepped into the arena, facing the same dangers, the same physical demands, and the same risks of injury and death, yet with additional layers of complexity. Their existence was rare, often treated as a curiosity by Roman society, and they carried burdens that were both similar to and distinct from those of their male counterparts. Life for a female gladiator was a continuous negotiation of strength, endurance, visibility, and societal expectation, each factor slow, measured, and unrelenting. From the moment they entered the training grounds, women gladiators were acutely aware of their dual position, participants in a deadly spectacle and objects occasionally specially designed scenarios intended to emphasize drama and danger. Each clash carried the potential for injury, permanent damage, or death. The sand underfoot, the swing of swords, and the clash of shields became part of a continuous, measured rhythm, one that demanded attention, endurance, and quiet acceptance of risk. Social perception added another layer to their experience. Female gladiators were admired for skill and bravery, yet often objectified or sensationalized. The crowd's gaze carried both fascination and judgment, creating a slow, repetitive psychological pressure. Spectators commented on strength, agility, and appearance, blending admiration with curiosity. Each gesture, each movement, each pause in combat was influenced not only by strategy but also by awareness of observation. The body and mind adapted to coexist with both threat and attention, forming a hypnotic cycle of performance and endurance. Training conditions were similarly rigorous. Female gladiators practiced with weapons, armor, and shields designed for their size and strength, yet the physical toll was relentless. Repetitive drills honed reflexes, sharpened technique, and increased stamina, but also slowly accumulated fatigue, bruises, and minor injuries. Recovery was gradual and methodical, closely monitored by trainers, yet always limited by the demands of upcoming spectacles. The slow rhythm of preparation, exertion, and recovery mirrored the daily existence of any gladiator, blending endurance with careful adaptation to physical stress. Medical care was often sparse and inconsistent. Injuries, whether small cuts or more severe trauma, required attention but were treated with rudimentary methods. Herbal poultices, bandaging, and basic splints were applied in slow, repetitive procedures. Infection and long-term damage were constant concerns. The body adapted to repeated strain and injury, slowly integrating scars, soreness, and fatigue into the rhythm of daily life. Endurance was cultivated not only through physical exercise but through measured recovery and acceptance of persistent discomfort. The rarity of female gladiators amplified psychological pressures. Constant observation, scrutiny, and comparison to male counterparts created a slow, pervasive tension. Every successful strike, every moment of hesitation, and every display of skill was judged and interpreted. Public perception influenced self-perception, shaping behavior, tactics, and posture in a subtle, continuous rhythm. The mind adapted to coexist with this constant duality: competitor and spectacle, participant and curiosity. Society's fascination brought both opportunity and limitation. While admiration could offer rare privileges or rewards, it never granted full autonomy or exemption from the dangers of combat. Female gladiators remained bound by the same constraints as their male peers. They trained, fought, and endured under external control, with limited agency over their daily lives. Fame was transient, safety rare, and freedom elusive. The slow accumulation of experience, repetition of training, and continuous negotiation with authority defined daily existence. The psychological endurance required was substantial. Fear of injury, anticipation of combat, and awareness of constant observation created a steady, unrelenting background tension. This tension was integrated into each moment. Movement, preparation, and engagement with opponents were performed with deliberate caution, repetition, and mindfulness. Over time, this repetitive vigilance became a pattern, a measured and hypnotic rhythm that mirrored the physical training and the mental adaptation demanded by life in the arena. Even interactions with other gladiators were shaped by the slow pace of observation and adaptation. Alliances, rivalries, and partnerships developed gradually, influenced by both skill and societal perception. Each action, each response, and each exchange contributed to the cumulative, measured rhythm of life, reinforcing endurance, awareness, and adaptation. Relationships were slow to form, tentative, and carefully negotiated, integrating into the broader pattern of observation, combat, and survival. Ultimately, the life of a female gladiator was defined by repetition, endurance, and continuous negotiation with danger, observation, and societal expectation. Their rarity amplified attention, curiosity, and scrutiny, while the fundamental challenges of combat, injury, and survival remained constant. Every movement, every strike, every breath was part of a slow, measured rhythm, integrating skill, physical adaptation, and psychological resilience. Existence in the arena became a continuous cycle of preparation, combat, and recovery, framed by observation and sustained by endurance, forming a hypnotic, repetitive, and unrelenting pattern of life. In this way, women in the arena experienced a life of constant challenge, observation, and adaptation. They moved through repetition, endurance, and measured attention, existing simultaneously as competitors and objects of curiosity. The slow, continuous rhythm of training, combat, and observation defined daily existence, creating a hypnotic, almost meditative pattern of life in which skill, survival, and spectacle were inseparable. Their experiences were distinct, nuanced, and meticulously repetitive, perfectly aligned with a calm, monotonous cadence of narration designed to lull the listener into sleep. Among the many realities of life as a gladiator, one possibility stood as a distant, almost mythical aspiration: freedom. It was the hope that, after years of training, combat, and endurance, the chains of servitude could be lifted, and a life of choice might be possible. Yet freedom was not guaranteed. It was rare, intermittent, and often symbolic rather than absolute. The wooden sword, or rudis, served as the emblem of release, a tangible token of emancipation, yet it represented a slow, drawn-out process of endurance and luck, rather than immediate liberation. The rudis was awarded only under certain circumstances, usually after repeated demonstrations of skill, bravery, and reliability. The gladiator's body, hardened by repetition, practice, and injury, had to prove itself continuously. Each fight, each drill, each demonstration of endurance contributed incrementally to the possibility of earning this reward. The process was slow, cumulative, and measured. Days, weeks, and years passed in repetition, conditioning both body and mind, as the hope of freedom remained a distant horizon, shimmering faintly at the edge of a life defined by control and risk. Even those who approached the possibility of earning the rudis did so with a careful, methodical attention to every detail of performance. Victory in the arena was necessary but not sufficient. Skill had to be consistent, injuries endured, and behavior exemplary. Compliance with authority, the maintenance of physical conditioning, and the repetition of drills were all slow, deliberate steps in a long and measured journey toward an uncertain reward. Freedom, when it arrived, was the result of endurance over time, a cumulative product of repetition, persistence, and the quiet negotiation of both opportunity and constraint. The rarity of such rewards magnified their significance. For every gladiator who attained the wooden sword, countless others remained in captivity, bound by contracts, debts, and ownership. The contrast between those granted freedom and those who continued in servitude reinforced the slow, hypnotic rhythm of expectation, disappointment, and endurance. The hope of liberation existed not as an immediate relief but as a distant marker, slowly shaping behavior, movement, and psychological adaptation. The anticipation itself became part of the monotonous cadence of life, measured, repetitive, and ever-present. Even when freedom was earned, it often came with slow, incremental limitations. The gladiator might leave the ludus, but social reintegration was gradual. Skills honed for combat were not necessarily useful in the broader world. Physical injuries, scars, and chronic pain were lasting companions, reminders of the repetition and endurance required to achieve release. The body, trained for the arena, required adaptation to a life beyond combat. psychological adjustment was similarly gradual, a measured process of redefining identity, negotiating social perception, and adapting to autonomy after long-term restriction. Rewards other than freedom were also infrequent and slow to accumulate. Monetary bonuses, public recognition, and minor privileges were intermittent and carefully administered. These rewards, while tangible, served as reinforcement of compliance, endurance, and skill rather than true liberation. Each token of approval was integrated into the slow rhythm of daily life, creating a cycle of performance, acknowledgement, and continued subjection. The repetition of this cycle reinforced the hypnotic pattern of existence, embedding endurance and obedience into both body and mind. The anticipation of reward created subtle psychological effects. Gladiators learned to balance hope and acceptance, integrating the potential of future freedom with the slow, daily realities of servitude. Every drill, every combat simulation, and every fight was influenced by this dual awareness. The immediate need for survival and performance, and the long-term measured aspiration toward a rare reward. The mind adapted gradually, developing patience, endurance, and acceptance of uncertainty. This slow, persistent expectation became part of the hypnotic rhythm of existence, a quiet, almost meditative companion in the repetition of daily life. Even tales of freedom earned by others circulated slowly, shaping perception and behavior. Stories of the wooden sword, told and retold, provided both inspiration and caution. They reminded gladiators that freedom was attainable yet extremely rare, that endurance and compliance were prerequisites, and that the rhythm of life was dominated by repetition, risk, and incremental progress. Each story contributed to the monotony of expectation, reinforcing the slow, measured cadence of existence and preparing the mind for gradual, persistent endurance. Ultimately, the possibility of freedom and reward shaped life more through anticipation than immediate change. The wooden sword, the symbolic emblem of emancipation, remained a distant goal, slowly influencing behavior, movement, and the repetitive tasks of training and combat. It was a marker on the horizon, a slow, persistent guide in a life otherwise defined by constraint, observation, injury, and repetition. The rhythm of preparation, endurance, and subtle hope became intertwined, forming a continuous hypnotic cycle that dominated daily experience. In this way, rare cases of freedom and reward were not only exceptional but also foundational to the slow, repetitive rhythm of gladiatorial life. They created a measured balance between constraint and possibility, between enduring present challenges and anticipating future liberation. The body, trained over years of repetition, absorbed skill, endurance, and resilience, while the mind adapted to the steady cadence of hope and uncertainty. Every day, every drill, every fight was integrated into this continuous, measured rhythm, forming a hypnotic, repetitive, and persistent pattern of existence in which the distant promise of freedom remained a subtle, guiding presence. The life of a gladiator in ancient Rome carried a weight far beyond physical exertion or visible injury. Beneath the armor, beneath the muscle, and beneath the carefully honed skills lay a slow, persistent psychological burden. Every day was marked by anticipation, endurance, and awareness of danger. The mind absorbed the rhythms of repetition, the monotony of drills, and the constant presence of observation. The psychological toll was cumulative, almost imperceptible at first, but gradually, quietly, and persistently shaping thought, emotion, and perception of existence. Fear was an ever-present companion. The possibility of death was not distant or abstract. It was immediate, slow, and continuous. Each step into the training grounds, each swing of a weapon, each encounter in the arena carried a potential for fatal consequence. The mind adapted to this awareness in a rhythm that was repetitive, measured, and slow. Anticipation of danger became a constant, subtle background hum, integrated into every motion, every decision, and every breath. Over time, this constant presence of fear became almost habitual, a slow, rhythmic part of consciousness that persisted even during moments of rest. Emotional numbness often developed as a survival mechanism. The repeated exposure to pain, injury, and death forced a gradual desensitization. The body endured and the mind adjusted, blending endurance with muted perception. Moments of loss, whether the injury of a comrade or the death of an opponent, were acknowledged slowly, measuredly, and often internally compartmentalized. This numbness was not sudden. It was the result of long, gradual repetition, of observing cycles of combat, survival, and mortality over months and years. The rhythm of existence imposed a methodical, almost hypnotic, emotional regulation, quietly shaping the internal landscape. Loneliness was intertwined with the life of a gladiator. Despite living among peers, instructors, and trainers, the personal isolation of those who faced life and death combat was profound. Bonds could be formed, but they were measured, tentative, and constantly negotiated. The shared experience of training and survival created a slow, subtle companionship, yet every individual ultimately carried the weight of expectation, danger, and potential injury alone. The rhythm of solitary endurance became a quiet undercurrent, integrated into every step, every drill, and every fight, shaping thought in repetitive, measured patterns. Uncertainty defined each day. Unlike a life governed by consistent routine, gladiators faced unpredictable outcomes. Even the most careful preparation could not guarantee safety in the arena. Injuries were frequent, outcomes were contingent, and survival was never assured. The mind learned to navigate this uncertainty in slow, measured increments, integrating anticipation with endurance, acceptance with vigilance. Every action, whether during training or combat, became a step in a repetitive cycle of preparation, evaluation, and cautious execution. The repetition of cautious, deliberate responses became internalized as a steady, monotonous rhythm, shaping perception of risk, movement, and decision-making. The cumulative effect of fear, numbness, loneliness, and uncertainty was profound. Psychological endurance became as necessary as physical strength. The repetition of experience, the slow accumulation of observation, and the constant presence of danger created a subtle, persistent pattern of mental adaptation. The mind absorbed the rhythm of life, integrating anticipation, vigilance, and controlled response into the slow cadence of daily existence. Emotional regulation, endurance, and cautious awareness became internalized patterns, repeated and reinforced over months and years. Even fleeting moments of respite were shaped by the slow rhythm of survival. Rest, meals, and temporary safety were colored by anticipation of the next training session, the next fight, or the next public spectacle. The mind remained vigilant, rehearsing potential outcomes, predicting challenges, and adjusting movement and strategy. The psychological toll was cumulative, persistent, and quietly pervasive, influencing thought, perception, and behavior across every moment of waking life. The unpredictability of life, combined with the constant scrutiny of authority and the observation of the public, reinforced repetition as a coping mechanism. The mind developed slow, methodical patterns of thought. Anticipate, observe, endure, perform, survive. These patterns repeated, layered, conscious movement reinforced survival, and each slow, deliberate adaptation contributed to the gradual shaping of psychological resilience. Over time, the psychological toll became a defining feature of gladiatorial life. Fear, emotional regulation, loneliness, and uncertainty intertwined with repetition, physical conditioning, and observation to create a slow, measured, and persistent rhythm of existence. Each day was an exercise in endurance, preparation, and adaptation. The cumulative effect of repeated stressors, slow adaptation, and continuous vigilance shaped both mind and body. The pattern of life became a subtle, persistent cycle, hypnotic in its repetition, measured in its endurance, and unrelenting in its quiet influence on thought and perception. As the life of a gladiator is slowly considered, the mind begins to trace the long, unbroken rhythm of existence, measured by repetition, endurance, and anticipation. Glory, fame, and public admiration existed alongside fear, pain, and the constant threat of injury or death. Each day followed a rhythm that was at once monotonous and relentless, a cycle of preparation, training, performance, and recovery, repeated over and over, embedding itself into the very essence of existence. The slow accumulation of these days created a life defined as much by its constraints as by its rare triumphs. The paradox of this existence is central to understanding its full weight. A gladiator could be admired, celebrated, and even temporarily idolized. Yet these moments of recognition were always intertwined with the reality of servitude, danger, and control. No victory erased the presence of authority. No applause provided complete relief from the persistent, hypnotic demands of survival. Repetition, routine, and incremental progress dominated life, embedding a slow rhythm into thought, movement, and perception. Each swing of a sword, each step across the arena floor, and each carefully measured drill reflected a continuous cycle of endurance, subtly guiding behavior and thought over months and years. Fame, when it came, was fleeting. Recognition by the crowd, praise from trainers, or temporary rewards did little to change the fundamental structure of life. The psychological toll remained. Constant vigilance, the anticipation of injury, the emotional regulation required to endure monotony and pain, and the quiet, persistent awareness of mortality. Repetition, monotony, and endurance continued to shape each day, each action, and each breath. The slow, measured cadence of life imposed a rhythm that intertwined skill, survival, and observation into a continuous pattern. Physical endurance, developed through repetition, drills, and combat, intertwined with mental adaptation to create a life that was both exacting and hypnotic. The slow accumulation of scars, the gradual hardening of muscle, and the methodical development of skill reflected a rhythm that was constant, repetitive, and unrelenting. Survival depended not only on strength or agility, but on the subtle internalization of repetitive patterns, anticipation of attack, measured response to injury, and controlled management of fatigue. The body and mind became synchronized in the monotonous cadence of practice, performance, and recovery, a slow, persistent cycle that carried through years of life. Even rare moments of reward or recognition were absorbed into this rhythm. Whether earning a minor prize, achieving a victory, or glimpsing the distant possibility of freedom, these instances were integrated slowly, measuredly, and deliberately. Hope was a subtle, persistent companion, influencing repetition, endurance, and performance without disrupting the hypnotic monotony of daily existence. The anticipation of reward reinforced obedience, skill, and repetition, creating a measured, incremental shaping of both mind and body. The uncertainty of each day contributed to the hypnotic repetition. A single match could alter fortune, injury could limit movement, and death could come suddenly. Yet these uncertainties were navigated slowly, step by step, through the repetition of drills, careful observation, and methodical adaptation. The mind integrated vigilance, awareness, and endurance into a rhythm that was continuous, persistent, and quietly dominant over daily experience. The repeated navigation of risk became habitual, a measured and subtle cadence that mirrored the physical repetition of combat and training. Social observation added another layer to the continuous pattern of life. Authority, trainers, fellow gladiators, and the crowd exerted influence that was absorbed gradually, shaping action, posture, and movement over time. Each step was measured, each action considered, each moment performed with awareness of both immediate survival and long-term consequence. Observation, repetition, and endurance interwove slowly, creating a hypnotic, almost meditative experience. The repetition of these patterns reinforced survival, skill, and the quiet acceptance of the slow, measured constraints of existence. Even pain, injury, and emotional strain were absorbed into the rhythm of life. Each wound was treated methodically, each bruise endured quietly, and each emotional burden managed through the repetition of training, observation, and controlled response. The body and mind adapted incrementally, embedding resilience, endurance, and cautious awareness into the slow cadence of daily life. The repetitive nature of these experiences reinforced the hypnotic rhythm of existence, blending external demands with internal adaptation over long periods. Ultimately, the life of a gladiator can be understood as a continuous, measured pattern of repetition, endurance, and subtle adaptation. Danger, recognition, skill, and constraint interwove slowly, creating a persistent rhythm of existence. Days, weeks, months, and years accumulated in repetition, embedding experience, expectation, and cautious hope into the mind and body. Each drill, each fight, each step across the arena floor reflected a slow, hypnotic cadence, shaping thought, movement, and endurance in quiet, persistent ways. As reflection winds down, the full picture emerges. A life simultaneously celebrated and constrained, marked by both danger and skill, observation and endurance, repetition and rare reward. The rhythm of daily existence, slow, measured, and persistent, defined the experience of every gladiator. Survival, skill, and adaptation intertwined in a continuous, monotonous, and hypnotic pattern. The body and mind, shaped through repetition and endurance, carried the legacy of a life of both glory and danger, a continuous cycle of preparation, performance, and recovery. In the quiet conclusion, the slow, deliberate cadence of existence settles, drawing attention away from urgency, away from action, and toward the hypnotic rhythm of endurance. Life, with its risks, rewards, repetition, and anticipation, becomes a measured, continuous experience, a steady, persistent pattern, gradually winding down into stillness. In this final reflection, the world of the gladiator slows, allowing thought, breath, and awareness to align with the monotony, endurance, and repetition that defined existence, softly preparing the mind for rest and sleep.